Assalamu alaikum. Today we will discuss the white matter of the cerebrum. White matter, it lies under the cortex and contains nerve fibers, predominantly myelinated, neuroglia, which are the supporting cells, blood vessels for the nutrition. The nerve fibers originate, terminate, or sometimes both within the cortex. You can see all these fibers within the white matter. Depending upon their origin and termination, these nerve fibers are classified into three types. These are association fibers, projection fibers, and commissural fibers. We will discuss them one by one in detail. Firstly, we will discuss the association fibers. These are the fibers that unite different parts of the same hemisphere. They are of two kinds, short association fibers and long association fibers. Short association fibers are those that connect the adjacent gyri. As you can see in this diagram, these are the short association fibers as they are connecting the adjacent gyri. Then long association fibers, those connecting more distant gyri. As you can see in this diagram, these are the long association fibers. These are also the long association fibers because they are connecting the distant gyri. Short association fibers mainly lie immediately beneath the gray substance of the cortex and connect the adjacent gyri, while the long association fibers, as I told you, they connect the distant areas of the cerebral cortex. They link the primary sensory area in the parietal, temporal and the occipital lobes to the association areas of the cerebral cortex and to each other. These are superior longitudinal fasciculus. You can see they connect the frontal, parietal and temporal and occipital lobes. Here are the frontal and the parietal lobe. They will connect them with the temporal and the occipital lobes. This is one of the type of this long association fibers, which is known as superior longitudinal fasciculus. Next is the unsenate fasciculus. This connect the frontal. These are the unsenate fasciculus. They connect the frontal to the temporal lobe, contributing to the regulation of behavior. We also have the arcuate fasciculus here, which connect the gyri in the frontal to the temporal lobes, important for the language function. Here you can see the Broca's area and the arcuate fasciculus, which is connecting the Broca's area with the Wernicke's area. Broca's area, as you know, this is the motor area for the speech, and Wernicke's area is the sensory area for the speech, and arcuate fasciculus is the type of association fiber that will connect these two areas. Then we have the cingulum. You can see here the cingulum. It connects the frontal and parietal lobes to the parahippocampal gyrus and adjacent temporal gyri. This one is this cingulum just above the corpus callosum. Then we have the inferior longitudinal fasciculus that connect the occipital to the temporal pole and contributes to the visual recognition. Then we have the other type of white fibers, which are the commissural fibers. As I told you, the association fibers connect the same cerebral hemisphere areas, while commissural fibers connect the corresponding regions of the two hemispheres, and they have the corpus callosum, anterior commissure, posterior commissure and the hippocampal commissure, which is the commissure of the fornix. In this diagram, you can see this is the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is shown. This one with the F is the fornix. With the red is the anterior commissure, and with the green is the posterior commissure. These are the commissural fibers that will connect adjacent or corresponding areas of two hemispheres. First, we will discuss the corpus callosum, which is a type of commissural fibers. It is a fibrous bridge located in the depth of the median longitudinal fissure, and it connects the two cerebral hemispheres together. Shorter craniocaudally than is the hemisphere. Cranial end is nearer to the frontal pole of hemisphere as compared to the caudal end to the occipital pole. You can appreciate here the corpus callosum starting from the frontal lobe and ending towards the occipital lobe. The fibers in the corpus callosum connect the corresponding regions of the two hemispheres with each other except the inferior part of the temporal lobe. Just inferior part of the temporal lobe will not be connected, otherwise all corresponding areas of hemispheres will be connected. Fibers linking the two frontal poles with each other curve forward and form a U-shaped anterior forceps, or known as the forceps minor. You can appreciate in this diagram, this is the corpus callosum, and the fibers which are linking the two frontal poles, these are the frontal poles, F4 frontal pole, then they will go upward or forward and form a U shape, forming the forceps minor or anterior forceps. While the fibers which are connecting the occipital poles, they will curve backward, they are curving backward and form a U-shaped, forming the posterior forceps, or also known as the forceps major. You should know what is forceps minor and what is forceps major. Forceps minor is anteriorly towards the frontal pole, while the forceps major is posteriorly towards the occipital pole. Then parts of the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum, if we start anteriorly, have the most anterior part is the rostrum, then a bend which is known as the genu, then body, then the posterior end is known as the splenium. These are the four parts of the corpus callosum. Firstly, the anterior commissure. This one is the anterior commissure. We are discussing about the commissural fibers. Up till now, we have discussed the corpus callosum, which is one of the commissural fibers. And I have also discussed its parts, forceps minor, forceps major. Now we are discussing another type of commissural fibers, which is the anterior commissure. This one is the anterior commissure. And the bundles of the fibers run transversely in front of the anterior columns of the fornix. It connects the inferior and middle temporal gyri and the olfactory regions of the two hemispheres. Then we have the hippocampal commissure, third type of the commissural fibers. These are the bundles of fibers which run transversely between the crura of the fornix. This is the hippocampus with the fimbria. These are the crura of the fornix. And these are the fibers which are running transversely between the crura of the fornix. These form the hippocampal commissure. They connect the two hippocampi with each other. Note that the hippomammillary fibers do not cross. The mammillary fibers, they are not crossing. Then we have another type of the commissural fiber, which is the posterior commissure. This is the rounded band of white fibers crossing the midline on the dorsal aspect of the upper end of the cerebral aqueduct. Here is the cerebral aqueduct with the black arrow. It is just above the cerebral aqueduct. located between the superior colliculus and the pineal body. This one is the superior colliculus and this one is the pineal body, is located between them. It connects the left and the right midbrain and plays important role in the bilateral pupillary reflex. Now come the last type of the white matter, which is the projection fibers. We discussed the commissural fibers, association fibers. Now we will discuss the projection fibers, which is the last type of the white matter of the cerebrum. These are the fibers which are running vertically through the hemisphere and consist of cortical afferent fibers and cortical efferent fibers. Cortical afferent fibers convey impulses to the cerebral cortex, mainly thalamocortical fibers, while the cortical efferent fibers carrying impulses away from the cortex to the lower centers. These are corticostriate, corticobulbar, corticopontine, corticospinal, and the descending autonomic fibers. These all constitute the projection fibers and come under the category of cortical efferent fibers. Deeper to the cortex, these fibers are arranged radially as the corona radiata. You can see here, these are the corona radiata and these are arranged radially. Then the fibers converge to form a sheet called the internal capsule. This one is the internal capsule that passes between the thalamus and the basal ganglia. Here is the thalamus and this one is the basal ganglia. This internal capsule run between them and continue in the crus of the midbrain, basilar part of the pons and pyramid of the medulla oblongata. If you recall the brain stem, I told you that all the fibers of the descending pathways or the ascending pathways, they cross through the corona radiata, internal capsule, then throughout the brain stem. These fibers are the projection fibers. These continue in the spinal cord as the corticospinal tract. Again, this diagram you can see the corona radiata, this radially arranged fibers. Then these radially arranged fibers will converge to form the internal capsule and then these fibers will run throughout the brainstem. Now comes the internal capsule. Internal capsule is a bundle of projection fibers passing through the interval between the thalamus and the basal ganglia. This is the hemisection. You can see here, this one is the thalamus and these are the basal ganglia, and this with the green is the internal capsule. So the internal capsule are the bundle of projection fibers that passes between the thalamus and basal ganglia. The internal capsule has the 5 parts. Firstly, the anterior limb, then this band is the genu, then posterior limb, then is the retrolenticular part and also the sublenticular part. So it has 5 parts. Anterior limb lies between the caudate and lentiform nuclei. This one is the caudate nucleus and this one is the lentiform nucleus. These are the parts of the basal ganglia. Then we have the genu, then posterior limb, which lie between the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus, as you can appreciate in this diagram. Then we have the retrolenticular part. It is just caudal to the lentiform nucleus. Then we have the sublenticular part, which is not visible here. This lies below the lentiform nucleus and cannot be seen in this section. Now we come the fibers related to all parts of the internal capsule. Firstly, the anterior limb. It contains the thalamocortical projection fibers that connect the mediodorsal nucleus of the thalamus with the prefrontal cortex. They also have the frontopontine fibers. So the point to note is the There are two types of projection fibers which are located in the anterior limb. These are thalamocortical and the frontopontine fibers. Then in the genu are the corticobulbar fibers, and in the posterior limb there are the corticospinal, corticobulbar and thalamocortical projection fibers. These are mainly from the VPN nucleus to the primary somatosensory cortex, and VAN and VLN to the motor regions of the cortex. You can just remember the name of these fibers: corticospinal, corticobulbar and thalamocortical projection fibers. This would be enough, I think. Then we have the retrolenticular part of the internal capsule, which contains the thalamocortical projection fibers. They have the geniculocalcarine fibers which form the visual radiation from the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe, and few geniculotemporal fibers which form the auditory radiation from the medial geniculate nucleus of thalamus to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. Then the last part of the internal capsule is the sublenticular part. It contains the thalamocortical projections, geniculotemporal fibers. They form the auditory radiations from the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. In this diagram, different parts of the internal capsule are shown. This one is the anterior limb, genu, posterior limb. Here is the lentiform nucleus, thalamus and the caudate nucleus. Here is the sublenticular radiations are shown, which are forming the auditory radiation, while the renticular radiation are here, which form the optic radiations. Some clinical features are the bilateral lesion of the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, as in the carbon monoxide poisoning. It will lead to the loss of identification of the nature of objects, which is known as the object agnosia, and the individual faces, which is prosopagnosia. The elementary VN remains intact. Damage to the corpus callosum leads to the split brain syndrome. The two halves of the brain behave relatively autonomously. Means they have no interconnection, because corpus callosum is related with the connection of the two cerebral hemispheres through its fibers. So there will be no connection between the two cerebral hemispheres, and the brain will behave autonomously, independently. If there is damage to the splenium of the corpus callosum, it leads to the posterior disconnection syndrome of alexia. Means cannot understand written material without agraphia, can speak and write without difficulty. Thank you.